An old topic that's come back to the forefront in recent years is feminism. There were times when women weren't allowed to vote, or own property, or many other things. Those times are gone, at least in the United States. The second wave of feminism was about breaching societal barriers, the women's lib movement. While not a complete success, most of the problems they complained about have been rectified as well. But new wave feminists have come out acting as if the problem of sexism is stronger than ever and are actually going against what the first two waves of feminism sought to achieve. While this isn't directly a statist versus libertarian issue, there are some parallels. And of course a lot of feminists are wanting government action to correct it. If that's you, and you want to convince us that this is a problem we need to address, here are some things you need to do. 1. Figure out what feminism actually means and stick with it. Pretty much every time someone tries to get a definition of what feminism is, it's defined as political and social equality between men and women. That's all well and good. If you define it that way, use it that way. But when we look at new wave feminism, their behavior says that this is not what they really mean at all. Feminists rightly complained about infant female circumcision. Even though that's no longer practiced in this country, we should be globally conscious. However, many of these same feminists react with hostility when we also want to get them to join us against infant male circumcision as well, even though that happens a staggering amount of the time in this country. 50% of male infants in the United States are circumcised, even though there's absolutely no medical reason to do so. And it is actually fairly likely to result in some sort of sexual dysfunction later in life, which is exactly the same problem with female genital mutilation the feminists complain about. It's the same principle. And so if your movement really is about equality, you should be on board with us about it. All forms of infant genital mutilation are bad, regardless of sex. Many activists supported the legal reform surrounding rape in the United States in the 1970s and 80s. But when it came time to try to apply these same concepts to male rape victims, activists found themselves opposed by many prominent feminists who thought that rape was their issue. To be fair, many other feminists were on the side of the men on this issue. Because of their opposition, it wasn't until 2011 that the FBI finally recognized that men even could be raped, and to this day do not recognize forced envelopment of the penis as a form of rape. But if you think rape is horrible and that rape victims deserve justice, you must apply that concept to both female and male victims of rape and to all forms of forced sexual intercourse, both penetration and envelopment. Here's a tip. If your proposal for your solution or policy cannot be stated without referring to the concepts of male or female, you're doing it wrong. And speaking of rape, 2. Stop misusing the word rape. Rape is a legal term with a specific meaning, and for good reason. Without getting too technical, it's forcing someone to engage in some sort of sexual activity without their consent. That's it. What that means is, if you give your consent to have sex, it isn't rape. And although feminists are absolutely correct when they say that if a woman withdraws consent during intercourse and the male continues anyway, it becomes rape, that concept does not extend to the time after the intercourse is over. You don't get to retroactively withdraw consent and make a consensual act into rape. Another thing New Wave feminists say is that a woman who is drunk cannot consent. Therefore, it's rape to have sex with her. This is true only if the woman is unconscious or otherwise unable to express her consent or refusal. But if you want to say it's rape, even in cases where the woman does express her consent, then you have several problems to deal with. The first is that this isn't recognized anywhere else in our legal system. A drunk person who drives gets the drunk driving ticket. The cop doesn't say, "Oh, well, I guess you're drunk, so you didn't consent to driving." Same thing if a husband gets drunk and beats his wife. We don't say it wasn't his fault because he wasn't actually able to make a decision there. The only way you would have a defense here is if you didn't get drunk of your own free will, like if someone spiked your drink without your knowledge. But if you deliberately took the actions that resulted in you becoming drunk, then you are responsible for the decisions you make while drunk. And that includes the decision to have intercourse. You don't get to claim some sort of special dispensation here. Another is simply this. What if the guy is drunk too? Are they both raping each other? The feminists who make this claim generally dismiss this part. It's always the guy's fault. I guess it goes back to that feminist idea that men cannot be raped. I'm sorry, but if you want feminism to be about equality and not the oppression of men, you cannot take this position. And what if the guy is drunk but the woman is sober? Again, in order to be consistent, and in order to have your definition of feminism be equality between the sexes, you must recognize this as rape as well. Either both of these are rape, or neither one. Make up your mind. But feminists love throwing the word rape around. One feminist online said that she was raped when her father beat her mother. Now, this is a very traumatic thing for a child to witness, or even an adult, I would suspect. I'm sure she has psychological damage that comes from experiencing this heinous act of violence, and thus her father was abusing her as well as her mother. I fully understand and agree with that, but it's not rape. It gets really extreme. One feminist blogger said that any time a penis is put into a vagina, it's rape, because intercourse is never something a woman would voluntarily consent to. Look, that may be how you feel, but you are not all women. Stop pretending that any woman who disagrees with you is only doing so because she's been abused by the patriarchy. Actually, that's good advice for all you feminists. Stop treating women who disagree with you as though they're the enemy, especially when there are other feminists like Christina Hoff Sommers or Erin Pizzi. Additionally, 3. Stop misusing the word oppression. Oppression means that some authority, otherwise considered legitimate, is using force to stop you from exercising your rights. It doesn't have to be anything as extreme as stoning women for committing adultery. It could just be something as simple as government stopping you from speaking out. But oppression isn't when someone criticizes you for what you say or has a speaker at your college that you don't agree with, causing you to run off to your safe space. Here's the thing about freedom of speech. It works both ways. If you have a right to state your opinion, other people have a right to respond. And yes, that's also the case if the responses contain insults. You do not have the right not to be insulted. Insults are not oppression. Get over it. Now, it is true that a lot of feminists have gotten death threats for the things they say. But here's the thing. So does anyone who takes a controversial position online. Libertarians get death threats all the time, but you don't see us going on about how that makes us oppressed, do you? And I tell you, we love pointing out oppression. We just know it when we see it. And I gotta tell you, some of the things you brought forth as death threats aren't death threats at all. Sorry, but you should kill yourself is not a death threat, nor is you will leave this world having accomplished nothing. You're saying this is oppression and it only happens because you're a woman? Come on! I get worse things than that automatically sent to my junk folder. You're not the victim of some patriarchy just because you're getting the same reaction every other activist on the internet gets. And by the way, it's also not oppression or a threat to your reproductive rights because you don't get to force someone else to pay for your birth control. Oppression would be banning birth control to begin with, which actually might apply to the U.S.'s policy of keeping birth control pills as prescription drugs when most other countries allow them to be sold over the counter. Funny how you feminists aren't opposing that in any visible way. Here's something else to consider. Walmart, Walgreens, and other pharmacies have made it so the contraceptives are available for just $9 a month and working to make them $4 a month. But in states such as California, Pennsylvania, and several others, the government won't allow them to make contraceptives this cheap because they call it cutthroat competition. Why isn't this a legitimate oppression of your reproductive rights? You have actual oppression going on right under your noses from both federal and state governments, and you do nothing about it. Of course, if you're really against oppression, you have to be against it all the time, including when it's your side doing the oppressing. Like when feminists tried to shut down the Fine Young Capitalists, or when they used a bomb threat against a Gamergate meetup, or swatted Gamergate activists. Yet you don't even acknowledge that these things have happened, even when they were instigated by prominent feminists, let alone spoken out against them. This tells us that you don't really believe you're being oppressed. It's belief in belief at best. The actual oppression here is coming from feminists, from getting speakers they disagree with banned from college campuses, college students suspended or even expelled for saying things contrary to New Wave feminist dogma, or ruining men's lives by falsely accusing them of rape, only to cry oppression when the liar's lies are exposed. Probably the most prominent example was when prominent New Wave feminists, including Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian, went in front of the UN to complain about how they're so oppressed. Notice how their so-called oppressors don't get to speak before the UN, and how we need to stifle free speech to stop this. Sorry, but when you can get speakers and students banned from speaking at your university, when you can get national media attention with not even any attempt to get the other side of the story, when you can get an episode of Law and Order presenting your side uncritically and depicting those who disagree with you as monsters, and especially if you can get in front of the UN and talk about how those who disagree with you should be silenced, then you are the privileged oppressor. 4. Stop saying we live in a rape culture. According to New Wave feminists, we in the U.S. live in a rape culture where the patriarchy deliberately stops female rape victims from getting justice. Let's think about this. Is there inherent racism in our court system? If a black person and a white person commit exactly the same crime and have exactly the same background, criminal record, etc., in other words, everything is identical except their race, then the black person is more likely to be arrested. If both of them are arrested, the black person is more likely to stand trial. If both stand trial, the black person is more likely to be convicted. And if both are convicted, the black person is likely to get a harsher sentence. From this, we can legitimately conclude that there is systemic racism in our justice system. Now let's take this concept and apply it to gender. If a male and a female commit exactly the same crime and have exactly the same background, criminal record, etc., in other words, everything is identical except their gender, then the male is more likely to be arrested. The male is more likely to stand trial. The male is more likely to be convicted, and the male is likely to get a harsher sentence. So why isn't this an example of sexism going the other way? The court system favors women over men. And we're not even getting into issues like divorce and child custody, where the sexist disparity is even greater, and about which feminists are completely silent. Oh, but we're in a rape culture, so it's somehow different with rape, huh? Okay, let's think about that one. You complain about the things that a female raped by a male has to go through, but what about males who are raped by females? Is there ever any example of them getting justice? The few times they have actually managed to get their cases into court, it's always been some other crime like sexual battery, where the female convict gets a much lighter sentence. But in most cases, they aren't taken seriously at all. Police won't make arrests. Prosecutors won't prosecute. Judges even throw the cases out of court, when that never would have happened if the genders were reversed. And you're complaining about rape culture because people won't just listen and believe? Because female rape victims have to actually provide evidence? It's rape culture just because we don't automatically believe what they say? Sorry, but this flies in the face of every principle of justice. Innocent until proven guilty is paramount, both in the courts and in society at large. The burden of proof is on the accuser, and every defendant has the right to face his accuser. Again, you are the one wanting special privileges here. Not only that, but false accusations of rape ruin lives. And don't even bother to bring up the red herring about how few accusations of rape are false. First of all, your statistics on that are bogus since they consider all failed convictions to be oppression and evidence of rape culture instead of an indication that the accusation might not be true. But second, because we're examining your claim of having a rape culture where rapists are excused and privileged. This is not the case, and you need look no further than the Duke lacrosse rape scandal to prove it. This is where a woman, Crystal Magnum, a stripper and a prostitute, falsely accused 3 members of the Duke University lacrosse team of raping her at a party at the team captain's house. Action against them was swift and immediate, precisely the guilty until proven innocent attitude the feminists are screaming out for more of. The entire lacrosse team was suspended, their coach was forced to resign, and these 3 innocent boys had their names dragged through the mud in the media while Magnum remained nicely anonymous. District Attorney Mike Nafong was placed in charge of the investigation, in contravention of the policies of the Durham Police Department. Nafong, apparently in an attempt to court black and women voters in the upcoming primary, a contention supported by statements from his campaign manager, immediately distributed posters affirming the student's guilt before any actual evidence was collected. despite the fact that repeated rounds of DNA testing showed no DNA from any of the 46 lacrosse team members, whether they were accused or not. The only DNA found was from Magnum's boyfriend, and despite the fact that the accused had several alibis which included photographs, ATM records, cell phone records, and taxi records showing that they weren't even present during at least some of the time this alleged rape had occurred, and despite the fact that even Mangum's own friends who were at the party with her said that they were with her all the time, and her claims were, quote, a crock, Nifong nonetheless proceeded. After multiple witnesses, including friends of Magnum, came out saying that not only was she not raped, but she planned ahead of time to make a false accusation, and after the director of the DNA testing lab publicly stated that Nifong had illegally withheld exculpatory evidence from the defense, and after Mangum herself made public statements that contradicted earlier statements, changes that were made to explain away evidence that falsified those earlier statements, the North Carolina bar filed ethics charges against Nifong, citing multiple instances of fraud, deceit, and misrepresentation, as well as abuse of prosecutorial discretion, ultimately resulting in his disbarment. Finally, over a year later, the North Carolina Attorney General dropped all of the charges and declared the 3 players innocent, something attorneys general do not like doing. But in this case, there really was no option open to him. Their innocence screamed out from every single piece of evidence. Now, here's the point and how this goes against the feminist claim of rape culture. Despite all of this, the 3 accused players, and even their former coach who had absolutely nothing to do with it anyway, have continued to receive threatening emails and hate calls, exactly the kind that New Wave feminists say they get because they're oh so oppressed. Other male Duke students received threats even though they weren't even members of the lacrosse team. They were even met with angry mobs banging pots and pans outside their windows early in the morning. Even after all of this came out and the charges dismissed, only 2 news outlets, Fox News and MSNBC, revealed Mangum's name and photo. ABC, PBS, CNN, NBC, and many others never published Mangum's name at any time. Meanwhile, 2 of the accused lacrosse players had to move to other colleges, the third having graduated that year. They still, to this day, have difficulty living their lives in peace, society punishing them for something it was proven that they never did. Nifong, meanwhile, is being hailed by feminists as a martyr for their cause. William Cohen even published a book painting Nifong as a courageous prosecutor, tackling the dangerous patriarchy and failing. Despite the fact that the book was soundly refuted by every expert who actually worked on the case, it was given glowing reviews in the New York Times, Salon, The Economist, and the Wall Street Journal. As for Magnum, she's still held up as a hero of feminism. The fact that she's currently serving 14 years in prison is obviously the result of retaliation by the patriarchy and has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that she murdered her boyfriend by holding him face down to their kitchen floor and stabbing him in the back repeatedly. Must be that patriarchy thing again. Look, in an actual rape culture, people would not be vilified based on the mere accusation of rape. Even the accusation is enough to ruin lives, even when proof of their innocence is unmistakable. No, we do not live in a rape culture. If you want to know what an actual rape culture looks like, Saudi Arabia is a pretty good example. 5. Be consistent. So much of what we've talked about deals with hypocrisy, and as we said back in part 1, nobody who matters listens to hypocrites. You're not going to get anywhere by having double standards. Standards must apply consistently regardless of gender. That's what you say feminism is, but as we've seen, New Wave feminism is anything but. The so-called wage gap is a perfect example. This is the observation that women make 77% of what men do for the same job. But several times, economic analyses have been published showing that, once all other factors are controlled for, this wage gap drops below the level of statistical significance. And yet, when someone invited on a news program as an expert tries to point this out, they are shouted down by the likes of Rachel Maddow before they even get to make the point.
Women don't make less than men? Actually, if you start looking at the numbers, Rachel, there are lots of reasons for that.
Wait. Women make less than men for doing the same work?
No, because...
Wow. Okay.
Men work an average of 44 hours a week. Women work 41 hours a week. Men go into professions like engineering, science, and math that earn more. Women want more flexible
professions. Listen, this is not a math is hard.
No. But every greedy businessman in America would hire only women, save 25%, and be hugely profitable.
I feel like this is actually... I mean, it's weird that you're interrupting me, not letting me make my point.
The fact of the matter is, there are just as many jobs where women earn more than men, such as Hollywood producers and directors, wholesale buyers, TSA screeners, social workers, and counselors. CBS and Business Insider claimed that there were only 9 such jobs and no more, where Forbes had previously published a list of 15. And despite New Wave feminists repeatedly complaining about sexism in STEM fields, in those jobs, the difference in pay between men and women is below the level of statistical significance. The reason for what differences there are stems from women making different decisions. They're less likely to have a degree in the field they're working in. They're less likely to take a more risky job in their field, even though those tend to pay more. They're more likely to take time off to raise a child, and thus have more absences from the workforce, which always affects what you're paid, regardless of whether you're male or female. Now, you can argue that these choices are because of how our culture views women. You may be right. But if so, it means that the problem happens long before the job application is filled out and needs to be addressed on that basis. Not only that, but this gap is only significant with older generations and has disappeared among 20-somethings. This indicates that these cultural differences have already been corrected for. If you really believed what you say, you'd be declaring victory and trumpeting your success all over the world. And deservedly so. But you're not. You're insisting that the problem still exists, and anyone who denies it is a sexist trying to perpetuate the patriarchy. That's the action of someone with a political agenda, not an activist. And again, it makes you the privileged oppressor. If you want to be consistent, you have to complain about the jobs where women are paid more just as much as you do the jobs where men are paid more. Just like you have to complain about all infant genital mutilation, not just female, and have to advocate for all rape victims, not just female. 6. Stop calling defense victim blaming. For some reason, New Wave feminists think it's horrible to do what First and Second Wave feminists advocated for vocally, letting people know what the risk factors were for getting raped and how they can avoid it. For example, you're more likely to be raped by someone you know than by a stranger. In fact, the CDC has a page full of risk factors to watch out for and how they can be avoided. But the New Wave feminists hate this. They call it victim blaming. The first problem is that they don't say this about any other form of protection from crime at all. Has anyone ever said that it's victim blaming to tell someone it's a good idea to lock their door when they're not at home or at night when they're asleep? Is that blaming the victim for any potential robberies? This is a dangerous and even sexist concept that not only does nothing to protect women, it actually perpetuates the ones who are truly in difficult situations. As psychologist and forensic consultant Ofer Zur pointed out in his paper, Rethinking Don't Blame the Victim, The Psychology of Victimhood, published in the Journal of Couple Therapy, while the feminist and civil rights principles are undebatedly just, some have carried the principles to illogical extremes. There are those who would consider the culpability of a woman who knowingly dated a man who had previously raped her on a par with that of a young girl victim of child rape. While it is clear that abuse of women by men is unjustifiable under any circumstance, still it is important to differentiate between relative degrees of responsibility. The victim stance is a powerful one. The victim is always morally right, neither responsible nor accountable, and forever entitled to sympathy. To adhere to a victim ideology, which states that victims are always and completely innocent, is absurd. It has yet to be widely understood that by alleviating all women or any victim from any and all responsibility to predict, prevent, or even unconsciously invite abuse is to reduce them to helpless, incapable creatures and, in fact, re-victimizes them. This takes us to the second problem, infantilization. This is in contrast to the empowerment of the previous waves of feminism. Infantilization necessarily paints a picture of women as not the strong, capable, independent human beings the women's lib movement worked so hard to promote, but as helpless creatures in need of others to coddle them and give them protection, usually by the government. This claim is little more than a lame attempt to grab attention. First of all, blame by definition isn't constructive. Telling someone to lock their doors, or how to avoid being raped, or how to escape an abusive relationship is constructive. As Zur wrote, blame is counterproductive, but the politically correct attitude of non-blame, when it produces a climate that forbids exploration of the role of victims in systems of violence, is dangerous as well. Fear of blaming preserves and perpetuates the systems of abuse and victimization. Tied in with this is the concept of professional victimhood. People find that they can get attention, money, and even press coverage if they can show they're somehow a victim of someone, hence the need to construct the patriarchy. This explains the effects we already covered in number 3. Of it, Zur wrote, not only do people wish to claim the status of victim, the legal and political systems promote and legislate it as well. What seems to be a noble, justified, long overdue act of protecting a victim can easily turn to blame and warfare. When this happens, conflict, injustice, and victimization are perpetuated, and the possibility of resolution and healing is destroyed. We have become a nation of victims, where everyone is leapfrogging over each other, publicly competing for the status of victim, and where everyone is defined as some sort of survivor. Shamelessly, many people in recovery compare their individual sagas of abuse in alcoholic families or sexual harassment on the job with the experiences of World War II Holocaust survivors who endured the atrocities of the concentration camps. Today, it is fashionable to be a victim. We've seen this as well with feminist victims of harassment online, meaning they get the same trolls as the rest of us do, claiming to have PTSD as a result. Like their delicate feminine sensitivities are no match for that awful collection of phonemes. More infantilization. Moreover, the misinformation stemming from all of this can be dangerous. Let's say you hear a feminist talk about an encounter in an elevator with someone who asked her out for coffee, and it made her feel uncomfortable for the rest of the ride. Social justice warriors responded en masse to this, saying it was a potential rape scenario. The problem is, it isn't. Rapists hardly announce their intentions beforehand, and they don't often do it in somewhere like an elevator where there are security cameras and when the doors can open at any second. But let's say a woman is in a hotel elevator and encounters something similar. From hearing all of that, she's made to be afraid that this man is a rapist, so she hits the door open button and runs off to the hotel room of a friend of hers or a family member for comfort. The fact is, she is much more likely to be raped by that friend in the hotel room than by the stranger in the elevator. You're putting her at greater risk. And I know what a lot of you are thinking. Well, my friend wouldn't rape me. I wonder how many of the rape victims who were raped by a friend would have said the same thing. Are women in the habit of becoming friends with people they're afraid might rape them? This is incredibly dangerous thinking, and the danger isn't just to yourself, but others as well. As if all that weren't sexist enough, what they say to do instead is teach men not to rape. Yes, all men are potential rapists and just can't help themselves and have to be indoctrinated out of it. If this had been said about any other group, blacks for example, the bigotry would have been pointed out from every corner. But for some reason, New Wave feminists can get away with it. Look, the reason why someone robs a convenience store is not because he wasn't told not to rob. No one is saying teach people not to rob. Everyone knows the robber knows he's doing wrong. A rapist doesn't rape because no one told him not to. He rapes because he's a violent criminal, and that's the tiny minority, which is why rape statistics, like other crime statistics, have to be measured per 100,000 to get the numbers up to something manageable. Zur concludes, victims should never take total responsibility for their suffering. However, they must develop an understanding of how they contribute to their own victimization. Therapy must enable victims to break the dangerous and painful link between love and abuse while helping them realize that they deserve respect and dignity like any other human being. By understanding types, origins, and the mode of operation of victims, therapists and non-therapists alike will be able to recognize, prevent, and intervene in violent systems, enabling all participants to live better lives. For this to happen, victims must overcome their feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and low self-esteem. They must not focus on blame and avoid moral self-righteousness. They have to believe that they have a part in what happens to them and overcome their victim patterns. The healing process should empower them to become conscious contributors to the unfolding of their lives, which can become dignified and meaningful. That is what New Wave feminists are trying to take away from women. 7. Stop saying that everything is sexist. As Anita Sarkeesian recently said, when you start learning about systems, everything is sexist, everything is racist, everything is homophobic, and you have to point it all out to everyone all the time. Lacey Green says that everything is problematic regarding feminist issues. Anytime someone says something like that, watch out, because they're not actually looking for the real problems, and so they have no chance of actually finding them and offering solutions. Everything can't be sexist any more than everything can be green. If everything were green, then there'd be no need for the word. Green would be just another word for everything. You need at least one non-green thing you can point to in order for it to be meaningful. Logically, there is no difference between everything is X and nothing is X, because X is now a meaningless concept. Here's the thing you have to understand. If you're that determined to find something, you will, whether it exists or not. Green and Sarkeesian can't possibly have looked at every single thing in the universe and made that determination, so this is nothing more than an assumption, one that cannot be disproven. Wu begins with the conclusion and looks around for supporting evidence. Like the creationists, New Wave feminists start with the conclusion of sexism and patriarchy and make everything else fit that, just like a creationist looks around for any anomaly that will falsify evolution and support biblical creation. That's not how things work. Feminists, you are not immune from the principles of logic. Skepticism and the methods of rationality are not something you can get special dispensation from. If you're that determined to see sexism everywhere, you will. But all you're really doing is redefining feminism to mean one thing only: paranoia. 8. Stop using buzzwords and actually listen to the other side. The point of buzzwords, what some have called zombie terms, is to have an instant win, a way out of the debate when the facts and logic aren't on your side. They're substitutes for arguments that can be emotionally satisfying and might work with political pundits, but they have no intellectual validity whatsoever. Patriarchy is a perfect example. Every bit of inequality is due to the patriarchy, and as we just saw with number 9, there are no equalities, according to New Age feminists. But oddly enough, this happens even when women have the upper hand over men. Women having the upper hand in divorce and child custody cases is also considered an example of the patriarchy. Sorry, but you do not get to have every single possible outcome confirm your hypothesis. But even if it were, feminists seem strangely reluctant to speak out against it. If you really believe what you say, shouldn't you be fighting against that inequality as well? The fact that you aren't speaks volumes to us. Check your privilege is another one. Essentially, this phrase means little more than shut up. It's about shutting down the discussion by saying that since the speaker is privileged, his opinion is invalid, a blatant argumentum ad hominem. I've heard all sorts of excuses feminists give for saying this, that there's this that he's not understanding or that he doesn't know about. But they're admitting that the phrase is utterly useless. The thing to do there is to point out the information or explain what isn't being properly understood. And yet, check your privilege never seems to accompany anything resembling that. It's used to shut down the debate at that point, and any further discussion is just more abuse by the patriarchy. Probably the worst of all of these comes when someone does a thorough intellectual rebuttal of a feminist's points, and she comes back that he's just mansplaining. It's a complete disregard for everything that was just said and an insult to the intellect of an entire gender. More sexism far in excess of what the feminists complain about. If there were any problem with his logic or arguments, she'd be able to point it out. If you use this word instead of doing that, then don't be surprised if we conclude that you have no response to the arguments, but, like all woos, don't have the integrity to admit it. Another one we see a lot is objectify. One prominent example is with pornography. The woman has no agency at all and is little more than a sex toy. The biggest refutation here is that for the most part it just isn't true. Most forms of mainstream pornography have good camera coverage of the woman, showing her body, her face, and her reaction, and putting her in a very active role, whereas the male is there for little more than what he has between his legs. His face is shown far less than the woman's, and he generally vocalizes far less than she does. But it's also used in everyday life as well. Some guy looks at a beautiful woman and he's objectifying her, seeing her only as a sex object and not as an individual human being. But seeing someone as beautiful or sexy or even as an object for carnal desire is not mutually exclusive with seeing them as a human being. Again, this is an insult to an entire gender, as well as inconsistent, because when a guy is shown shirtless with sculpted abs, they don't say that women objectify him. And if you're in that subset of New Wave feminism that's sex negative, I'm sorry, but you're right up there with the Puritans and the Hanbali Muslims, saying that women should be covered all the time. You oppose the Top Free movement, which simply says that women should be able to go shirtless anywhere men can. You know, that whole equality thing again. We're against you because we keep hearing you say you oppose it because breasts are sexual, and any time a man sees a breast, he just can't help but go insane and rape her. Not only is this more hideous sexism far beyond the kind you're complaining about, but you're missing the whole point of the Top Free movement. By making breasts more common, you desexualize them. Breasts will still be sexual in an erotic context, and it's not objectifying women to say so, but the idea is to make them normal in non-erotic contexts. If you're against that, and you're saying that breasts are always going to be sexual no matter what, then you are the one objectifying women. And most importantly, there's one more thing you can do. 9. Give up the word feminism. I remember the feminism I grew up with. Second wave feminism, or the women's lib movement. The whole point of the movement was the empowerment of women as individuals, that women can do anything men can if people would just get out of their way. That is the feminism I support. Third wave feminism could not be more diametrically opposed to this. Now, women are helpless victims that must be coddled. You have to build a safe space that resembles a preschool nursery in case they hear anyone say something they disagree with. Government has to pay for their contraception, and if you don't agree, you're waging a war on women. We need to stifle free speech because women get PTSD whenever someone says something mean about them on the internet. Third wave feminism is not moving forward. It's slinking back to the medieval times that the real feminists of history worked so hard to dig women out of. There's a reason why the movement has gone so wrong, and it's a problem that was instilled in the concept from the very beginning. By calling it feminism, the founders of the movement, whether they intended to or not, based everything on groupthink. The idea was to stop the oppression of women. Of course that's a good thing. But when you have the group name in the name of your movement, you have the potential for the very corruption I've been talking about. Note that other movements haven't done this. When people were fighting for equality of blacks, they called it the civil rights movement, not the black rights movement or blackism. When you indicate the group in the name of your movement, and people identify themselves with that movement, the tendency is for them to identify with the name, and that leads to groupthink. If anything, the feminist movement as a whole is to be credited for lasting nearly 2 centuries before falling victim to this. The original feminists were very libertarian and ruggedly individualistic. Now, it's Marxist collectivist, and as such it has nothing to do with the equality or empowerment of women, but with making women a victim class, the new proletariat, with a patriarchy just another word for bourgeois. If you want to argue for feminism, you need to reject the third wave feminists, the new Puritans, the charlatans who paint women as a victim class as they personally seek to profit from them, trying to maintain the privileged lifestyle they grew up with without actually having to do anything worthwhile. But the best way to do this, to stop this from happening now and prevent it from resurging in the future, is simply to give up the label feminist. After all, what's in a name? Isn't it what the movement's about that's more important? So the best way is to stop calling yourself a feminist and start calling yourself an individualist. The benefits are great with no drawbacks. You get to build on the magnificent history of the first 2 waves of feminism without having to apologize for the Marxists and the man-haters and the new Puritans. Moreover, being an individualist also says what your position is on other subjects such as racism, equality among the races without the bogus collectivism that's designed to appear to help racial minorities while actually benefiting those in power at their expense. Above all, It helps greatly when you're trying to convince others of your position. By not lumping them into categories such as meninists, you avoid the greatest pitfall of all with every form of collectivism, when your side becomes the we, and everyone who disagrees is the not we, and becomes the enemy to be attacked, rather than a friend and potential ally to be convinced. So, feminists, whether your movement goes anywhere from this point on is entirely up to you. You can eschew Marxism and collectivism and make the movement become great as it once was. Or you can continue on the way it is now. But if you do that, all you're doing is showing that you don't care about women at all, only your own selfish greed and what you can milk out of the situation. And if you do that, your movement will fail for sure, and it won't be the fault of any patriarchy. It's entirely up to you.